Welcome to CuriousClicks. Today, we explore Venetian timber pile foundations and the evidence behind its most surprising mystery. How can heavy stone buildings stand for centuries on soft lagoon ground? That is the puzzle this documentary will solve. Before the history, we need to understand the physical problem, then follow the mechanism and the evidence until the answer becomes visible. Start with the scale of the problem. During the archaeological excavations, many of the piles dissolved after being in contact with air. 1. Early building piling foundations in Venice, Italy. In Venice, some of the early piling foundations were built on timber piles. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. 3 https://scholarsmine.mst.edu edu/7ich/session08/3 Evaluation of timber pile supported marine piers. Chicago, Illinois. River piers were constructed during the later part of 19th and early part of 20th centuries to handle increased marine freight traffic in the coastal regions of the United States. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. In order to diagnose the problems, cut the timbers into short sections and longitudinally split each section in order to see how far the preservative has penetrated. 6. Reuse of any treated timber pile supplied by an outside source is not recommended. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. Retrieved December 5, 2017. Further Redenjit Singh, Ram D. 2013. Evaluation of timber pile supported marine piers. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. Therefore, the relative weight sustained by the traceries alludes to the relative weightlessness of the buildings as a whole. 12. This, and the associated reduced use of weight-bearing walls, gives the Venetian Gothic architectural style lightness and grace in structure. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. In the 14th century, following two fires that destroyed the previous structure, the palace was rebuilt in its present, recognizably Gothic form. 14 churches at it inside the Frari, a wider view from the picture above, showing on San Marco at left the domes, fancy stone veneers, and at top left, 2 stone grills. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. It dominated the 14th century, and because of the city's conservatism, Venetian Gothic buildings, especially smaller palaces, continued to be built well into the second half of the 15th century. 1. And Venetian Renaissance architecture very often retained reminiscences of its Gothic predecessor. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. Palazzo Pisani Morta in the Sestiere of San Polo revivaled it. Palazzo Cavalli Franchetti, 1878. The style was revived in the 19th century, largely through the influence of British architectural critic John Ruskin and his treatise The Stones of Venice. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. Start with the scale of the problem. Jump up to Morrill, Jeffrey J., Helsing, Guy G., Graham, Robert D., October 1984. Marine Wood Maintenance Manual, a guide for proper use of Douglas fir in marine exposures. That sets the scale of the problem the rest of the explanation has to solve. The surviving evidence gives us a firmer clue. Contextedit Palazzo Pesaro Orfe, 15th century Venice is built on alluvial mud, and all buildings in the city were, and mostly still are, supported by large numbers of timber piles driven into the mud. Its value is that this is evidence we can inspect, not a detail added merely for atmosphere. Now follow the mechanism one step at a time. These platforms were used to support either earth fill and/or concrete arch supports, which in turn provided structural support for the main floor. This is one link in the cause-and-effect chain, The next step has to connect to it physically. Now follow the mechanism one step at a time. Not knowing the applied treatment, past use, or if diesel fuels have been applied to the surface used to give the appearance of a recent retreatment could decrease the life of the pile. This is one link in the cause and effect chain. The next step has to connect to it physically. Now follow the mechanism one step at a time. Some unscrupulous suppliers of used timber piles should be avoided because some contractors have applied diesel fuel to the outside of the piles to bring the embedded creosote to the surface. This is one link in the cause and effect chain. The next step has to connect to it physically. The design only makes sense when we look at what can go wrong, because the unstable ground discouraged vaulting, the structural raison d'etre of Gothic architecture, to allow the erection of higher and higher vaults, with more flexibility in ground plan, was completely irrelevant in Venice. In Northern Europe, traceries only supported stained glass. That gives the design a real boundary and shows what the successful system had to resist. The design only makes sense when we look at what can go wrong. De Slecht Toast and Van de Zedek Vanaf Demon, Jop Hands, second part, 1705, anonymous 1705 Dike period, 1950, after the disastrous damage wrought by the naval shipworm. Dike builders had gradually switched to constructions with low-gradient outer slopes. That gives the design a real boundary and shows what the successful system had to resist. This is also where the evidence has limits. Marmorino or Coxiopsto stuccos, made from grinding limestone, brick and terracotta fragments, was the typical finish for interior walls, and sometimes exteriors. 10 flat ceilings supported with timber beams were preferred to vaults, which might crack as the building settled on the pile foundations. That limit matters as much as the conclusion. A mature reconstruction should not claim more than the evidence supports. Return to the original question. How can heavy stone buildings stand for centuries on soft lagoon ground? The answer is not one magical component. The evidence shows how the relevant parts of Venetian timber pile foundations work together under real constraints. How timber piles driven into lagoon sediments support masonry buildings in Venice. That is the useful engineering story. A chain of causes that can be inspected, tested, and explained. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to CuriousClicks.